Welcome to the Rare Sense Podcast. This is Chris Irwin. Today I'm speaking with Robb Wolf. Robb is somebody who I consider to be a food expert. And those are my words, not his. But he's written 2 New York Times, Wall Street Journal best-selling books, The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. And he's most recently co-written Sacred Cow with Diana Rodgers, which talks about why well-raised meat is good for humans and for the planet. And you may have heard him talking about that on Joe Rogan, among other things. If you're familiar with the Rare Sense mind fitness paradigm, then you'll know it's comprised of 3 blocks: maintenance, orientation, and development. And maintenance is basically what we think of as physical fitness. It's sort of the foundation that everything else rests on. If you're going to have a healthy mind, you need to have a healthy body. So that's diet, exercise, and recovery. And then breath work is the other component that I throw in there that I think is crucial to having a healthy body. So I wanted to have Robb on to talk about diet because he's somebody that I trust and he's a friend and he's got an in-depth knowledge of the subject. Unfortunately, I only had him for an hour and there were other things that I wanted to get to, but hopefully I can get him back on at some point. And then we also had some technical difficulties with his video uploading specifically to the platform. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you're just going to see a Rare Sense logo. There's no video associated with this. It's audio only. But if you're listening to it on a streaming platform, you won't know the difference. Anyway, it was a great conversation, really interesting. I love hearing Robb's take on these things that I think are basically common sense, for lack of a better term, where he is able to lend some color to the way I feel about these things and set me straight in certain circumstances. But I hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, here's Robb Wolf. All right, Robb, how's it going, man?
Good. Another day above ground, so I'm calling it a win. Probably a loss for my wife. I think I'm worth more dead than alive, but I'll keep stealing that joy away from her as long as I can.
Right. Well, it's good to see you. We have lived now in the same state within
20-minute drive,
30,
25
minutes
minute drive. Yeah.
Okay, we're that close. And we never see one another. Actually, now my wife sees more of you because you go to the ice den.
The ice skating, yeah. Well, I do have to say, you guys had us over for dinner and you guys put on such an epic spread that I looked at my wife and I'm like, there's no fucking way we could match that. Like, we have to take them out for dinner. We can't. We won't be able to beat this. So you guys put on a hell of a spread.
You're the food guy, though. Like, you're supposed to be the one that's got the... Right?
I know. And I fully acknowledge I'm not remotely the smartest guy in the room, but I'm smart enough to know when I've met my better. And I've met my better in the Irwins when it comes to putting on an epic meal. So, yeah.
There's no plural in that. That is my wife. That
the Irwin. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I know how to cut cheese and like salami and stuff like that. So.
Well, you did a hell of a job on it. So...
Well, thank you. Yeah, I can pour wine. Okay. All right. Well, look, of all the guests that I've had on this podcast, and it hasn't been many yet, but I would say you're by far one that people are going to know, or at least some people will know. I think a lot of people will know. But regardless, just give a quick kind of overview of what you do, what you've done, who you are.
Sure. Ages ago, I was a cancer and autoimmunity researcher. I was looking at maybe an MD or an MD PhD track kind of in that space. And I've always been interested in health and human performance. At that time, I was tinkering with a vegan diet. And for me, it really didn't work super well. I ended up with ulcerative colitis, bad enough that I was facing like a bowel resection and kind of immunosuppressant drugs. I'm a 5'9", 175 pounds, not a big dude, but at the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was about 125, 130 pounds. So if folks are watching this, like if you could imagine 50 pounds less of me, I was in pretty dire straits. And this was around 1997, 1998 that things got really, really bad. And it's also when this idea of a paleo diet got on my radar. And it's kind of a long story how that came about. But I was so sick and so desperate that when this idea of a paleo diet got on my radar and I started doing some research around that, what was interesting is that most of what was written at that time talked a lot about gut and autoimmune issues. And again, I was so sick that it was kind of like, well, I've literally got nothing to lose. And I tried eating that way, kind of a low carb, what we would call ketogenic or paleo type diet. Definitely an eye towards immunogenic foods like gluten. I have celiac disease, so I have to be particularly careful with that. But it definitely saved my life. And it was such a profound experience that I just couldn't wrap my head around going to regular medical school and spending another 4 to 8 years just learning about pathophysiology before I even really got into work with people. And I really wasn't sure what I was going to do at that point. But it was about a year and a half later that I was poking around on the interwebs and I found this weird workout called CrossFit. And they had these like super high rep, Olympic lifts mixed with sprinting and gymnastic stuff. And I liked sprinting, Olympic lifting, and gymnastics. It had just never occurred to me to mix it together the way that they did. And I was hanging out with a good friend of mine, a retired Navy SEAL named Dave Warner. And we started working out in his garage. We basically converted his garage into a gym. And within like 4 months, we had about 15 people training with us. Like we just told people at work and different things like, hey, come work out with us and everything. And we're like, hey, do you think we could open like a gym and really do this? And I was like, yeah, I think we could. I mean, we haven't done anything yet. And, we had this kernel of people there. So we reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, and this was 2001-ish and early 2001. And we were basically like, hey, could we open a gym and call it CrossFit? And they were like, yes, go be achieve. And that ended up being the first CrossFit affiliate gym, CrossFit North. And then I had a chance to move back down to Chico, California, where I did my undergrad and opened what was then the fourth CrossFit affiliate, NorCal Strength and Conditioning, CrossFit NorCal, and worked in and around CrossFit for a number of years, went on to write a couple of New York Times bestselling books, did some work with Naval Special Warfare with the pre and post deployment, kind of retreats for the SEALs, the special boat teams and the families. And, I've just been really, really fortunate to be in this space where I feel like I do the type of medicine that I was really wired to do, talk about sleep and food and exercise and community. I for a long time have kind of coined this term, the gym is primary care medicine. Like that's where we should get the bulk of our needs, and like the doc in the box and all that stuff. I see that as secondary and tertiary medical care. That's when things have kind of gone off the rails, or you need emergency medicine or what have you. But that's kind of a 24, almost 25 years, and not too much longer than like 5 minutes, but that's like the big overview on it.
Yeah. So much of what I do is it's about mental health, right? Or what I call mind fitness. That's kind of my thing that I'm trying to bring into the forefront of discussion and sort of look at that the way we look at physical fitness and physical health, all the things you kind of talked about. But a big piece of that is like what we eat and how we exercise, right? Like that is a huge impact on I look at it as the actual impetus is mental, right? The reason you go to the gym is because you are, at least in that moment, mentally fit and have the discipline to get to the gym, right? But that will in turn make you feel better. That'll make you want to go again. And the same thing with food. And so I think where your expertise plays into what I'm doing and what kind of this podcast and what Rare Sense is about is like how we do that, right? Like how do we figure out what the best sort of physical fitness protocol is, the diet protocol, all of that. And you're somebody who was like, seems to be anyway, in my estimation, extremely prescient in your ability to kind of get ahead of these things. And I know you have a lot of opponents as well. People like, I know you've gone head to head with people for whatever reason. And I'd be curious about that too. But I guess where I want to start a little bit is, I'm a big proponent of people figuring it out for themselves. And you have to figure out what your bespoke formula is of all these things. Mm-hmm. And there isn't any it's not a cookie cutter situation or a peanut butter spread situation where it's like, here's the way everybody should eat. Here's the exact right diet, right? We've encapsulated it into a pill, and it's the same for everybody.
Right.
And the same thing is true with your physical fitness and your mental fitness and all of that. So I guess you're somebody who's very much done that, and then tried to, I think, give those lessons to other people. How do we do that these days? Because I think while I believe in that, the problem is there's a lot of bad information out there.
Right.
And when we say do your own research, there's a lot of shit research out there, right? Like you can find
you can spend
find
a lifetime. Yeah.
Right. And you can justify any position with internet research.
Right.
Which amounts to garbage. So how do you do that? And specifically, obviously, with what we're talking about, like the sort of dietary component of this and the physical fitness component of it. Where do you start? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah. For me, this evolutionary biology idea, that organisms kind of optimize for the environment that they're in. And there's some pushback around that stuff, but this is kind of Darwinian evolution type things. I find a lot of grounding in that. Like that seems like a good first principles place to start. I think that where kind of like the paleo diet ancestral health movement kind of went off the rails maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, 10 years ago, is that it didn't acknowledge the kind of nuance and variation within that. Like that is still, I think, a great place to start. Like if we're playing darts, that ancestral health model, sleep, food, exercise, gut microbiome, stress, circadian biology, God damn, that's getting you really tight grouping, really close to the middle. But it's not 100% perfect for every person. But if you've got to start somewhere, I think like minimally processed food, about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean body mass, a good omega-3, omega-6 ratio, going to bed earlier as opposed to later most of the time, keeping an eye on your gut health. The gut health thing is fascinating in that some people seem to do great with fiber. Some people, like carnivore diet, seem to do wonderfully with little or no fiber. And I happen to be in that camp. The end state is that I have to act in a way that my gut is happy and healthy. How I do that will vary for me versus you potentially, but it's still, we have some really nice lane lines that we can operate in using that ancestral health model. And then we can start iterating. Some people do better on higher carbs. Some people do better on lower carbs. Some people do better with like kind of a cyclical approach. Some people really need some lower intensity zone 2 cardio and a lot of it. And I happen to be one of those people. I tend to be very sympathetic dominant, like kind of twitchy and easily wound up and everything. And man, that zone 2 cardio is just the best medicine in the world for me. It's like 130, 140 beat per minute, an hour of that, 3 or 4 times a week it has improved my gut health. For the first time in my life, I went a year without suffering crushing seasonal affective disorder. I mean, it was just, we live in northern Montana, so like the light was not favorable. The only time that I've not experienced that is the 2 years I lived in a sunny area of Texas, and then if I'm in like Mexico or something like that, so those are nuances there. Like some people will do better in a sunnier environment and whatnot, but these pillars of sleep, food, circadian biology, gut health, basic nutrition, there's a lot of uniformity there, at least in the beginning. And then we can start asking some A/B questions, like, okay, you're not optimized. We assume this, let's up your protein. And if we're right about that, then XYZ should happen. And then you do it and it doesn't happen. And we're like, oh, okay, we had a wrong assumption there. But then we can start iterating and getting people closer to a reality. And I just haven't seen any other operating system function that way, relative to this evolutionary biology kind of ancestral health template. So that's really for me, the orienting piece to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, can you define that? So evolutionary biology, just kind of trying to dumb it down for people like me. What does that mean exactly? Like when we talk about that term?
When we go to national parks, what does the ranger say? Don't feed the animals. Why don't we feed the animals? Because we introduce types of calories and quantities of calories that are not appropriate for these critters, and it makes them sick. Like it legitimately makes them sick. One of the greatest challenges within modern zoos is that the food that they feed these animals tends to make the animals sick. The animals develop all kinds of diabetes and neurodegenerative diseases, autoimmune diseases that are unheard of out in the wild. Now, animals living in the wild have their own challenge, eating or being eaten, and usually kind of short lifespans. But this evolutionary biology perspective is really just kind of acknowledging that an organism has kind of optimized for a particular environment. Some animals or critters are nocturnal, so they function best, active at night, sleeping during the day. We're diurnal, so we tend to function best awake during the day, asleep at night. And it's not surprising that like folks who do shift work, the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, acknowledge shift work as a known carcinogen now. Like it's up there with tobacco smoking and radiation exposure and whatnot. And it shouldn't be super surprising because there's no other organism that can modify its environment the way that we can and have 24/7 light exposure and whatnot. And interestingly, our pets suffer a lot of problems because of our food access, because of the light and photo exposure. So this evolutionary biology idea is just this idea, and it does. Some people who have like a strong religious or spiritual background, like they really push back against it. For me, I don't really see the two competing with each other, but that's a whole other kettle of fish to unpack. But it's just this acknowledgement, or maybe a thought, that most all organisms have kind of an optimized environment that they can exist in. And when you start deviating away from that environment, there's something called the discordance hypothesis. The further away from that kind of like idealized environment that something is optimized for, the more potential there is for disease or difficulties to arise until you get enough generations to ensue to get an adaptation to deal with that. A good example of this is people who from different areas of Africa that developed sickle cell anemia. These areas are endemic with mosquitoes and a parasite that's in the mosquitoes that causes malaria. And although the malaria is incredibly damaging, the sickle cell anemia gene adaptation, if you have two genes for sickle cell anemia, you usually die pretty young, ironically. Like it actually comes at a pretty high cost. But if you only have one gene for sickle cell anemia, it provides an adaptive benefit so that the malaria parasite cannot set up shop in your red blood cells the same way that somebody without this genetic adaptation can do. And sickle cell anemia is the quickest spreading gene modification that we've ever seen in human history. But it also comes at a really high cost. Again, like if you have two parents that each have a sickle cell anemia gene and you inherit both of those, your likelihood of living past 20 years old is very, very low.
Whoa.
It's incredibly powerful.
And what is it? What is sickle cell anemia? Like
it causes your red blood cells to change shape, and they change shape in such a way that they don't move through the vasculature correctly. And they actually damage the vasculature, and they can give kids, interestingly, atherosclerotic plaquing that looks like they are a pack-a-day smoker, diabetic for 80 years, and then they die typically from a cardiac event. Interestingly, but now that you have populations of people, usually African American, that have moved to an environment in which malaria is not present, that sickle cell anemia trait is disappearing from the population really, really quickly because there's not the selection pressure of the relative benefit of having sickle cell anemia is kind of gone if you live in the United States versus some areas of Africa or Central America where there is malaria. So that's an example of like a lactase persistence, where usually humans lose the ability to digest lactose as they age. There are 4 or 5 different populations: Northern Europe, Africa, Asia, that develop different types of lactase persistence, where they continue to produce lactose as they or the lactase, the enzyme to break down lactose as they age. And then there are other populations. This is one of the things that was kind of missed within the broader ancestral health scene, is that technology can bypass some of this stuff. So there are populations that consume a lot of dairy, but they only consume it after it's been fermented. And so it removes the large bulk of the lactose, and then the dairy ends up not being a problem, and it's a really, valuable food for them. So those populations that developed a technology to deal with this problem never developed a lactase persistence gene to deal with it. And I think that is something that needs to be acknowledged within this ancestral health space, is that technology, whether it's cooking or different types of food processing, can change the way that people interact with their food and their environment, for sure.
Yeah. So let's go back to the, actually there's a couple things in there. One is that you mentioned the kind of the sunlight thing and pets. And I had somebody point out to me, not specifically, but I think I overheard this on another podcast, but they were talking about how if you watch your pets, they will always find the sunlight.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like by nature, they will do that. If there is sunlight coming through a window or if a door is open, certainly. And they're not doing that because Andrew Huberman said go out and get sunlight exposure. It's like they naturally know that it's a good idea to get sunlight. It's like recharging their batteries, right? And I think that sort of like takes some cues. I don't have pets, but these other animals that do these things instinctually, it's like sometimes taking a cue from them is a good idea, right? Like
without a doubt,
they just know that that's a good idea.
And they will self-regulate too. They get too hot or they feel like they've had too much, and then they'll go rack out in the shade. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So let's talk about, going back to just kind of the diet thing. So much media and, not pop culture, but sort of social media, the conversations out there, there's so much polarity of, especially now, like plants and meat. And it's like, you got people that are just like, we should only eat plants, right? Like meat is toxic, meat is carcinogenic. And then you got other people that are like, you should only eat meat, because I've even heard plants are toxic, like oxalates are toxic. And I think both you and I are people who say, hey, like both somewhere in the middle of that can work. And you, again, have to figure it out for yourself. But can you talk a little bit about, because I know you're a proponent of meat and you wrote Sacred Cow and the sort of health benefits there. Can you talk about if you go to the extremes either way, right? Like if you go completely vegan or completely carnivore, are there risks there? Are there things you don't get? Because like it's this kind of information that I think is important to have so that people can make their own educated decisions. And again, work with their own diet to optimize it for themselves and not say, hey, that person's eating meat, I'm going to just eat meat. And then it didn't work for me like it did for them. Why didn't it work? It's like, well, because you have not the exact same biology as everybody else out there, right? So, but can you just talk about that? Like if I decided to just eat meat, like nothing else, or something close to that, are there things that I don't get that from vegetables or fruit where that's important, right? Like I'm missing out on something, and then vice versa, right? If I just go the vegan route, are there things that I don't get?
Yeah, it's interesting. And my position on this has changed a lot over the last, say, like 8 years watching the carnivore scene. And it's funny because in my early paleo diet incarnation, I really held up as kind of a badge of honor the amount of plants I ate. It was like I'd go to the farmer's market and it was kale and broccoli and spinach, and I had these huge salads and stir fries and everything. And my gut health was better than what it was when I had ulcerative colitis, but I still always had these kind of niggling problems. And mine has never been constipation. Mine's kind of like food just kind of whooshes through me.
Yeah.
And so, I started, what was interesting is that when I first got into this paleo diet area, I'm actually the person that coined the term the autoimmune paleo diet, because we kind of delineated some processes that we thought would be beneficial for autoimmune conditions. And then some people like Dr. Terry Walls, who was wheelchair bound from multiple sclerosis, ended up reversing her multiple sclerosis with this kind of autoimmune paleo type diet, which her version of it is very plant heavy, actually. Like, it has plenty of meat and seafood and whatnot, but it's got a lot of vegetable matter in it too. But we have some great research from her quarter and from other places that suggests that this is a really efficacious approach for, say, like autoimmune disease. But there are a lot of people for whom the autoimmune paleo diet does not work. And then I saw people eating this just carnivore diet. And within carnivore, my God, there's a million different iterations of that. I call some of it one-cut carnivore, where people find that like ribeye from grass-fed meat is like the thing they can do, and they can't do ground beef because the ground beef ends up creating histamine because the meat gets to ferment a little bit, and so they can't do that stuff. And even within carnivore, there's all of this spectrum within that. But some interesting stuff emerges. Like, there have been studies like the Arctic explorer, Vladimir Johansson. I'm blanking on his last name, but he made some claims around what the Inuit diet was, which was mainly kind of meat and blubber, and people couldn't believe it. And so he did a metabolic ward study for over a year and just ate meat and fat, and he had water, and I think they allowed him like salt, and that was it. And he ate it for a year, and he was fine. His health was spectacular, no nutrient deficiencies. Within a carnivore diet, one could make the case that maybe vitamin C might be lacking. But interestingly, fresh meat does have vitamin C in it. It gets stored in the meat itself. And another interesting thing is that we see when carbohydrate intake decreases, our need for B vitamins decreases, our need for vitamin C potentially decreases. So the physiological needs of somebody eating a low carb or carnivore diet may be remarkably different than those of somebody eating more of a mixed diet. Like, you literally may need more vitamins and cofactors to be able to process carbohydrate. But it is worth noting that on a carnivore diet, we have examples of people going extremely long periods of time with no plant material. There's a woman who, due to rheumatoid arthritis that she developed in her late 30s, early 40s, has been on a carnivore diet for 26 years, and she looks amazing. I mean, she looks spectacular, no nutrient deficiencies, like you do blood tests, and she's doing great. I don't think that's going to work out that way for everybody. I think that you have a situation there where she had an illness that benefited from a carnivore diet, and her specific genetic makeup probably was quite amenable to doing that. I think that you might have people for whom that, they're not going to get the same kind of benefits and results. But there is a reality that there is no singular plant food that one could eat and not develop really overt nutrient deficiencies. Yeah, B12 deficiencies. B12 doesn't really exist other than in animal foods. B vitamin deficiencies. It's very, very difficult to get things like zinc and iron out of plant foods. Even if it's in the plants tend to have chemicals in them that really bind quite tightly to metal ions and whatnot. There was a fascinating study that looked at people eating seafood from either seafood alone with plain white rice, or seafood with this traditionally milled corn tortillas. And corn is particularly high in this substance called phytic acid. And what was fascinating is that the seafood is really, really rich in zinc. Like, one should get a really nice bump in the amount of zinc that they absorb into their body. But these people effectively absorb no zinc from that seafood meal due to the phytates in the corn tortillas. And so it basically bound all of that stuff. And what we see in like developing countries, what's kind of interesting there is that the people in developing countries usually have lesser access to meat and dairy and seafoods, and they have some super predictable nutrient deficiencies. Children tend to be shorter in stature, lower in IQ, lots of immune compromised situations because of some predictable problems with zinc, iron, B vitamin deficiencies. And then as a population westernizes, there's good and bad to it. Usually they get more meat, seafood, dairy, those sorts of things that are more nutrient dense. They also tend to ultimately end up getting more processed foods, which is not doing anybody any favors. But I clearly have a bias on this, but I really think that is well supported within the literature that if one is going to do a vegan diet, you're going to have to supplement. Like there are no two ways about that. The carnivore approach, you might need to, but I've at least seen a decent number of folks that go a really long period of time. We also have cultures that, like the Inuit again, that have tens of thousands of years of not exclusively a meat-based diet, but a very, very meat-centric, fat-centric diet. And these folks seem to do really well. I do think that this is a great place for people to tinker and explore. Like if somebody had gut or autoimmune issues, I would strongly recommend something autoimmune, paleo, carnivore-esque looking, because the most critical thing that person could do is get that autoimmune condition into remission. Get that thing into remission, and then start playing with what things on the periphery can I add in. Over the last 2 years, I figured out that I cannot do standard bovine dairy, just cow dairy, unless it's like cream or butter. I can tolerate that, and I can't do tomatoes. Like I have rheumatoid arthritis. I don't know if you can see in my knuckles, but like I assumed that my hand and wrist pain was due to jujitsu, because I've been doing jujitsu for a number of years. Just kind of it's just this low grade pain. But my wife made me a keto cheesecake 2 years ago, and right around January, and I got it was great, and I had several pieces of it. And then I woke up one morning, my hand felt like something was eating it from the inside, and I did some blood work, and I was like, oh, I have a really gnarly rheumatoid arthritis flare. I had to go on prednisone and some other stuff, and I traced it back to an intolerance to dairy and tomatoes. So even within this, like I kind of eat pretty close to carnivore. I eat a little bit of fruit because I feel like I would hang myself with piano wire if the only thing I could. I love meat, but if the only thing I could eat was meat, it'd be like it'd be really boring. So I do a little bit of fruit here and there, and I feel good with that. I like that. But like the dairy, eggs, and then ironically tomatoes crush me. Like they really flare up the autoimmune stuff. So I think that's where people again need to kind of dial that stuff in.
And it just goes back to, again, like taking ownership of this for yourself, in my estimation, and not just sort of buying into whatever the fad is or whatever. It's like, okay, take in all the information and then don't be stupid about it, but like it's a self-experiment of like, okay, what, to your point, like you spend a lot of time figuring out, okay, I'm having this reaction. This is inflamed. What could that be due to? And I always go to like, let's not go seek a drug to try to reduce the inflammation here. Let's figure out what I'm already doing that's probably causing this.
Right.
So on the plant thing and the evolutionary biology thing, and this is where I get to, and like my personal opinion is, this is just, again, Chris Irwin's opinion is, I feel like if all the technology went away and all the grocery stores went away and we had to go find food again, I think everybody would end up eating meat. Like you just couldn't survive. No farms anymore, no agriculture. Like it won't be long before you're hunting something and eating.
Right.
And I feel like most cultures for hundreds of thousands of years did that. So to me, thinking that that's unhealthy just doesn't make sense. I'm curious, are there any indigenous cultures that we know of that just ate plants?
No, and that's where Weston A. Price, he was a dentist in the early 1900s traveled the world looking at like the dental formation of different folks. And the less plant material generally they ate, the better the dental structure and the less the kind of dental caries and whatnot. You never found a purely vegan culture. There was a clear delineation between the hunter-gatherers and the pastoralists being taller, stronger, healthier, usually more warlike too. Like they just like to go stir stuff up more versus the more kind of plant centric. It is worth noting that the population on the planet that has the lowest recorded incidence of any type of cardiovascular disease is the Tsimane, which is a hunter-gatherer group in the Amazonian rainforest, and they by no means are carnivore. They eat plenty of plant material, but they also, one of their main staples is a type of wild pig, peccary, and so they're neither vegan nor carnivore. And they're incredibly healthy. Yeah,
right. And to me, that's just sort of it's natural stuff. There's no processing of any of that.
Right.
It's stuff that they have evolved to consume what naturally occurs. And I think, and just the same way that your body can kind of operate off of carbohydrates or it can become ketogenic, like our bodies can really adapt to the food sources that we put in, as long as they're natural and they're not garbage and they're not made in a factory and they're not full of all preservatives and all this other bullshit that we put in food. Right. So why there's a lot of people and there's a lot of, we hear this message a lot that meat is carcinogenic, right? That it causes cancer and heart disease and these types of things. And to your point, like I've been to Kenya where the Maasai, I'm pretty sure just kind of eats goat meat and drinks blood and goat milk. And that's basically their diet. And I don't think they have cancer or heart, I'm like not in the rates that we have in the United States. Right. So where does that come from? What is the evidence out there that suggests that meat is bad for you? Because I hear it a lot.
Yeah, you hear it a lot, and you'll see stuff that looks like credible, peer-reviewed research on this. We actually dug into this a lot in Sacred Cow, the book that I wrote with Diana Rodgers, and Diana actually did more of the kind of historical research on this. So this is the material that she really pulled out. But if we go back in history, not that long, and really almost anywhere that you want to land, food has always been a distinguishing feature of in-group versus out-group. Even within the hunter-gatherer groups within the Amazonian rainforest, in Africa, the few remaining groups there, like the Hadza had things that they would and would not eat that were different than the San Bushmen. And this has been a defining feature. If we look at the Abrahamic religions, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there are different foods that are on the menu and not on the menu. And it really defines the in-group versus the out-group. So there's a long history of this. Within the West, the kind of Seventh-day Adventist vegetarian-leaning approach really took on a lot of got a lot of headway in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. There's a great movie that has Matthew Broderick, the guy that played Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins. Like it's a great movie called The Road to Wellville. And that was originally
I've heard of this movie. I haven't seen it. But
it's a great movie. And it talks about the early naturopathic water therapy retreats where people would go do hydrotherapy and they would sit in the sun. They had a lot of stuff really dialed in on this, but this guy, Kellogg, had this kind of interesting religious orientation around meat and impure thoughts and sexuality and all this stuff. And he developed cornflakes as a means of feeding people, but what he determined in his estimation was that meat led to sexual lust and impure thoughts. And you could maybe make the case that that's true, because if you're well fed, you actually you feel kind of randy. This is one of the things that happens when people start working out in a CrossFit gym. Usually they're told to eat something like a paleo or zone type diet. They start doing good exercise. They feel good. And like we used to warn people, like, you'll get pregnant being in this gym, just fair warning, like everybody got more fertile. And he really adopted this thing that was kind of the opposite of this because of the kind of religious orientation and whatnot. But the whole field of registered dietetics was started within the Seventh-day Adventist religion. And so it's always had this very strong anti-meat orientation. And there have been claims, like meat putrefies in the colon and all this stuff. Meat's actually remarkably easy to digest. In World War II, when soldiers were critically injured, like there are these fascinating posters about why people back in the States were on low meat diets because of meat rationing. And it was basically, you're not having your meat so that he can have his, so he can get back in the fight. Like, it was understood that people who were sick, injured, wounded, needed this meat to be able to recover and get back into doing the stuff that they were doing. But, this flip side, the real orientation towards, meat causes cancer and all this stuff really came from this researcher, T. Colin Campbell, who is a professor of nutritional biochemistry, I believe at Tufts. And he wrote a book, The China Study, and it led into a book and film, Forks Over Knives. And they basically made a claim that these rural areas of China that historically had not eaten a lot of meat, as they began eating more meat, they developed higher rates of cancer and other types of diseases. Now, this is true, but the interesting thing is that these areas also began to smoke more, eat more sugar, eat more calories in general, and just generally adopted a westernized type diet. And when there have been some interesting digging into the raw data from the China study, and really incredibly smart researcher, Denise Minger, really got in and looked at this stuff closely. And what she found was that so if we were to correlate smoking and cancer, and we gave it an arbitrary number, it'd be like 10,000. Like, the correlation is incredibly strong. It's very, very high. The correlation between meat and cancer is like a 2 relative to 10,000. It's effectively background noise. What was interesting within the research that T. Colin Campbell did, wheat had a higher correlation with cancer than meat did, but they didn't include that in their analysis. Now, I don't know that it actually is anything other than noise as well, but that's really where this material came from. The way that they arrived at this, in part, was this this dietary trend change, which they also ignored. The longest lived population on the planet currently is Hong Kong. Hong Kong also, their average age is over 85 years of lifespan. Westernized, tight cultural bonds and whatnot. They also eat on average 2 pounds of meat per day. They're the highest per capita meat consumers on the planet.
Meat, like red meat, or is it
red meat?
Fish?
No, it's red meat. Okay. Yeah. Wow. I mean, they eat a mixture of this stuff, but like their red meat consumption is remarkably high. And this is another one of these things that just doesn't fit with the narrative. But what T. Colin Campbell did on the like laboratory side, they fed mice a toxicant called aflatoxin. It's a toxin that's found in mold. And then
mold toxin. I know the mold stuff really well.
Yeah. And so then they fed either high or low protein diets to these mice and looked at the rates of cancer. And what they found is that the higher protein intakes died from cancer sooner. And so they're like, okay, this is protein is bad, animal protein is bad. What they were feeding these mice was effectively whey protein, sugar, and corn oil. Like, it was a shockingly refined diet. It wasn't remotely anything like an ancestral diet for a mouse. And then what was interesting about this is that the high protein diet, it took longer for these animals to develop cancer. Like they had more resilience against getting cancer. Once you had cancer, the high protein diet accelerated the problem. But what they didn't report in the literature is that the high protein diet protected against getting cancer. So so there was a lot of confounding material in there that was really not honestly or transparently communicated in these situations.
Doesn't so much of that basically come down to inflammation? And this is part of like the puzzle you're trying to solve with yourself is like getting rid of anything that causes inflammation in your body. Right? To me, it just seems like so much comes back to basically that. Like if you are constantly inflamed, that's going to lead to probably the bad outcome. Right?
All the bad outcomes: cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease. I mean, it's almost trite at this point, but it's like any condition that you really care to think about. Usually, inflammation is kind of at the root cause of it.
I guess I should say chronic inflammation, right? Because short-term inflammation can be good.
Very
right? The
adaptive.
way when you work out and from that type of stuff causes acute inflammation. That's actually a good stress response or creates a good stress response in the body, right?
Yeah.
So there's two things. I know we're coming up on time here and you got a hard stop. So I only got about 10 minutes left. There's kind of two other things I want to, I'm trying to get to all these points that I wanted to hit.
Yeah, we could bleed over maybe like 5 or 10 minutes. We could bleed over a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned Hong Kong, and I believe they are on the list of what we would call a blue zone, right? Blue zones, which is
Hong Kong is not because they don't fit the narrative because they're a high meat consuming environment. So they're not. Okay, on
so
that.
Interesting, but sort of you can correct me here on the definition, but there's this notion of blue zones, which are a lot of coastal places, a lot of the Mediterranean, and these are places where people can live to be, or in a higher proportion, live to be 90, 100, much older age. And so there's a lot of people who speculated that that's because of their diet, and that diet is more sort of towards the vegetarian kind of vegan side of things. I think what you would argue, and we've talked about this before, is that's not exactly true. They actually do eat a lot of meat and fish and other animal products. But then the other thing that I always want to bring up about this is we always look for, when we talk about longevity, and this is a hugely hot topic right now, and all these hacks that we can do, we can dunk ourselves in ice water and red light therapy and saunas and you name it, starve ourselves, right? For fasting, right?
Right.
And that's great. Like, cool. I mean, like, that's a good thing. But so much of it always comes back to food. When we look at like these populations, like this population, they live to be very, very old. And it's always like diet. And we never, or it seems like we don't focus on like the other things they do, like their social interactions and like their sunlight exposure and maybe even the fact that they take a nap every day. There's like all these other components that we just kind of like ignore as if that's not part of the picture.
And the blue zones are really interesting. So one interesting fact, do you know the one food that is universal to all of the different blue zones?
I'm going to try to guess here. The one food that is universal to all.
Okinawa, you have Seventh-day Adventists, although it doesn't super duper apply to the Seventh-day Adventists. You have areas in Costa Rica, but there's one food that is more ubiquitous among all of these places than any other food. It's pork.
No, I don't know.
It's pork.
No way. Really?
Yeah. So that's one thing. Then there's another thing. Some folks got in and really looked at the way that the data was collected around the blue zones. And I'll pull it up, but there's a wonderful, every once in a while, the titles of scientific papers are really kind of pithy and they're like, there's some humor in it. And it's basically the blue zones, places in which no birth records are kept and shoddy death records are maintained and overall short life expectancy is the expectation. Basically, the paper makes the case that this was all fraud. And what they found is that, so these are like in the areas of Costa Rica, the average lifespan is very short. except in these people who are claiming that they are exceptionally long-lived. And what ends up happening, whether it was in Costa Rica or some of these other places, an uncle would die, then like a nephew would take on his name, and now he was Uncle Eduardo or whatever. And so it was basically this huge fraud going on with this stuff. And it's so they're not particularly long-lived. Like when you really get in and look at these different places, they had super poor birth records. They had super poor death records. There was actually no real data. So much of this stuff was like, oh, yeah, he's 106. And it's like, oh, okay, prove it. Well, we don't have any records of it. So that stuff was kind of
So we shouldn't eat pork. That's the lesson. Don't eat pork.
Or maybe you do eat pork. I don't know. But so this is one of the great ones. People will go on and on and on about Seventh-day Adventists, in the United States, because they do have an on average longer lifespan than the rest of the U.S. population. Well, the U.S. population relative to other westernized countries has one of the lowest average lifespans because we eat horribly and we have, poor lifestyle factors and whatnot. But what is never mentioned is that Mormons live just as long as Seventh-day Adventists, but yet they eat a mixed diet. But they also have strong religious convictions. They have great community. They generally do have a health-oriented lifestyle. Like, you go to Mormon communities, they work out. Like some of the greatest like enclaves of CrossFit are within Mormon communities. Like they go wild over this stuff. Yeah,
There's
they
no
drink relatively little. Like there's a little bit of drinking Seventh-day Adventist populations, a little bit in Mormons, but they don't drink, they don't smoke, they tend to exercise, and they have strong cultural values. But nobody mentions like somehow the Mormons just get like there are all these great papers. It's like, what about the Mormons? The Mormons eat a mixed diet. They eat plenty of meat and they live just as long as the Seventh-day Adventists do.
Yeah, well, and again, it goes for me. It's just like it's not just the diet,
right?
It's all of that other stuff. Like if you eat it, you can have a really great diet, like really dial that in. But if you're stressed about it all the time, if you're just worried about everything you put in your body and you're isolated and you have no community. Like those are all really contributing factors to your health as well.
Absolutely.
It's not just the calories and the type of calories and macro and micronutrients, right? Like so much of it is your mindset every day and your interaction with other people and all of that,
Yeah.
I just think we get so siloed in our thinking in that way.
Peter Attia, I don't have his book right here in easy reach, but he just had his book Outlive that released, and it's kind of a longevity orientation. He made a really interesting point, which was that there's no food, any food that has any strong signal one way or the other, either for health or for disease as an individual item. Sugar, wheat, meat, the bugaboo of all the different dietary camps. Whereas when you look at sleep, the signal is so profound. Like people will die within 11 days of overt sleep deprivation. Exercise, like the protective benefits of modest amounts of it. And I mean, this is just like getting off the couch and going for a walk more days than not. It's stunning what that does as far as reducing morbidity and mortality. And this isn't even getting into like, I'm going to try to optimize like my VO2 response and my muscle mass for my age matched, cohort. Like when you do things like that, you look like a different species. Like you and I being, I'm 51, you're late 40s, right? So
47.
You're 47. Yep. We're like a different species compared to the rest of our age cohort because we're in half decent shape. I mean, it's literally like there's a speciation event there. And it's just mainly like, diet's a factor. Like I definitely need to lean into my diet more because of these health issues. But there is kind of a reality that the fact I sleep, the fact I move almost every day in some sort of a dedicated, thoughtful way. I have wonderful community, really supportive community. Goddamn, like that, I've got the deck stacked in my favor coming and going.
Totally.
When I've got all that stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. The sleep thing is, I'm actually reading Why We Sleep. I think it's Matthew Walker's book. It's one of those books it was sort of like, did you listen to Andrew Huberman did this podcast where he talks about alcohol, like what it really does to you?
Yeah.
And it was just the most depressing thing because it's like it's just terrible for you. Like there's no upside. And I'm somebody who I like red wine.
A glass of wine,
It's not like I drink it every night, but I definitely like that. And I actually think my personal opinion here is I think it can be healthy when done infrequently, and especially in communal settings when it's like you have people over for dinner and it's part of, again, I looked at sort of those blue zone people, like they do that a lot, actually. It's like they sit down for dinner with people and it's like a conversation for 2 hours and we're going to share some wine. We're not getting blasted, but I think it can be healthy. And I take the example of my mother, who my entire adult life and maybe even beyond, she has had a glass of wine every night. Like every night she has one glass of white wine. She goes to bed at 9 o'clock. She sleeps 8 hours at least a night. And she's such a non-stressed person. She's just like nothing gets her rattled and she's just kicking it, right? She's getting into her mid to late 70s at this point. And it's so much of, you know what I mean? Like that can be a part of I think a part of a healthy lifestyle. If it's not abused and all of those other things are really dialed up, right? In terms of the way you live your life. But anyway, I think the point I was getting to with that was some of these things, this is part of this, like it can stress you out, right? Like you dive into something like that, you listen to Huberman's thing on alcohol and you're just like, oh my God, this is like, if I have one drink, I'm going to die. Right? Like it's just, it's horrible. And then you read Matthew Walker's book about sleep and it's like, oh my God, the amount of damage I've done to myself with bad sleep, with sleeping after drinking, all of that, bad circadian rhythm, working at night, like you name it. It's just so detrimental. And the hard part for me is always like being like, it's okay. Like just work with what you got now. Right. Like just try to adjust you can't do anything about that. But yeah, sleep is one that I take a lot more seriously now. Like I don't do as much like get up at the crack of dawn. Like if I go to bed early, that's fine. And I do some of that, but there's many days a week where I sleep till I wake up and I make sure that it's about, and it is for me. I don't know if it's probably slightly different for different people, just like diet and exercise and all these other things. For me, it is about 8 hours. Like if I go to bed at 10 o'clock, I'll wake up about 6 a.m. You know? And the more I've leaned into that actually there's nights now where it sounds like this shouldn't be abnormal. I actually sleep the whole night. Like I'll sleep 7-8 hours in a row and wake up. And so, yeah, I mean, you mentioned, I saw something on social media you put out about that, like where it was like, you're basically saying, I wonder if I had, instead of focused so much on diet, I had really focused on sleep as the sort of primary thing. And,
because I've always talked about sleep a lot, but it's diet by its nature just creates a adversarial situation. Whereas if I was like the sleep guy and somebody's having sleep issues, and we put a continuous glucose monitor on them and they were getting hypoglycemic events in the middle of the night, I'm like, let's reduce your overall carbohydrate load and let's look at some immunogenic foods. Then we backed into good nutrition as a proxy for making better sleep. Then I just wonder if like there would have been more success, more reach, less of those fights, because I wasn't directly like the food guy, but I was the sleep guy that just used food as a means to get people better sleep and optimized health. Yeah.
So coming up on time here, but sort of last thing that I wanted to go over here, if we've got a couple of minutes. And this is really around your book, Sacred Cow, because I think it's a great book. I highly recommend it along with your other books. But it speaks to something that I think is really important. This goes into kind of my like, let's not be stupid about this. And that is, there's a lot of talk about factory farming, meat, and its effect on climate change, right? There's sort of talks about the health things with meat and vegan and versus carnivore and all of that. And then sort of ethical treatment of animals too. And what your book does, I think a great job of is say, we're talking about three separate things here. This isn't one argument, right? So we've got kind of like ethical treatment of animals, which I think we should all be concerned about. Of like, look, we don't want to be cruel. Like that, right? That's a concern we need to think about. There's sort of like climate change and like, okay, what's really going on there? And let's like dig into some of the claims about factory farming and anything else that might be out there about cow farts and stuff like that.
Right.
And then the health stuff, like, is this diet healthy? And to me, that's the conflation of those things is part of the problem, right? And I actually saw this. The best example was when Biden was running for president. He was doing like a town hall, and somebody stood up and said, "Hey, given what we know about how meat processing affects climate change, would you change the dietary recommendations for Americans?" And I thought, those are two different things. Like, right? If we figured out that meat was like part of a great diet and the best part of the diet, well, then if the way we produce that is truly affecting the climate, well, then we need to figure out how to produce it in a better way, not change the dietary recommendations, right? Because like if that's healthy for people, it's like, okay, that's really healthy. We need to figure out it's, you know what I'm saying? Like I couldn't believe it. Just seemed like a real gross obtuseness on those items, not being able to separate those arguments.
Yeah, I mean, so the book that we turned in is almost 300 pages long, and like you said, it covers the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. Mm-hmm. When we turned in the rough draft, it was 600 pages long, and we had to whittle it down by 50%.
That's a tough sell on people, man.
Yeah, that's a big lift. The 300 pages was a lot as it was, but like this environmental part, like there have been claims made at very high levels, like World Economic Forum levels, that 78% of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the animal product sector, which is patently false. It's less than 2%. And that 2%, whenever we are talking about a living system, whether it's termites or clams or what have you, it's part of what's called a biogenic system. Like there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that gets brought into a plant. That plant gets consumed by an animal. Some of that plant may get converted into methane as part of the cellulosic fermentation, and it gets put out into the environment. Methane is a greenhouse gas, and it's many multiples. It retains more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does. But methane only has a half-life of about 10 years. When it's out in the environment, ultraviolet radiation hits it. It cleaves it into carbon dioxide and water, and then it's back into a cycle. So the carbon that is part of methane, that's part of carbon dioxide, that is part of a living system, it just cycles. And thank God it does, because otherwise life on the planet would grind down to a halt. So it's a tiny contribution to the whole of like greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a cyclic contribution. So it's almost like this part, however many animals you have living, dying, decomposing, belching, doing their thing, it's just happening in the background. And it's not really changing the net effect of carbon in the environment. What really changes that is tailpipe emissions from cars and planes and all that type of stuff. And what we had to do, or what I felt like we needed to do, was really illustrate the true magnitudes of what was going on here. That the contribution from the animal sector is literally a rounding error compared to transportation. Mm-hmm. Like it's like you could contribute or not contribute. It doesn't even matter to the total amount that happens from transportation. But yet, really important entities are suggesting that it is the contributor. And if you say that it's the contributor, then we're going to focus on it as the problem. And if it's not the problem, and that's where we put all of our resources, we are screwed. Like it makes me think of like the drunk driving machines where like it'll emulate you're drunk because it'll like put a time lag into you turning and braking and all that type of stuff. Okay. We're operating with just shit information. And this is what did Powell say right before the 2008 economic implosion? We have offloaded risk because we've financialized all of our debt and we are safe. And then the whole thing blew up because economies are way too complex for people to manage in that process. And now we effectively have the same thing, but kind of on the other side, people suggesting that we, with pinpoint accuracy, can know what the total climactic endpoints are going to be 100 years from now, when the climate is so much more complex than what we can really wrap our heads around. That's not to say we shouldn't try, but just if it's that complex and it's that difficult and there's so many parts in it, and we're focusing on literally the one thing that might actually be of service to us, because the point that we make in the book, and this has been well documented, well-managed grazing animals, whether it's reindeer or cattle or horses or what have you, are a net carbon sink. They put more carbon back in the ground than what they release into the environment, even as part of that carbon cycle. So we're not focusing on the real problem, and we're vilifying something that might actually be a solution. And so I just the danger to that, to me, is it's difficult to really properly state how dramatically impactful that could be, and it's a big topic to unpack. Well,
and I think you spoke to part of the problem of everything we do these days is we want to find the problem. We love to we got to find the thing, the one thing that we can vilify and say, there it is. We just get rid of that, it'll all be okay. And it's like, it's just like anything. It's like our bodies. It's like our mental health. There's no there or the there. It's like a multifaceted, complex, layered thing, right? That you have to peel back piece by piece. And we just can't afford to be so kind of simplistic in our thinking, I think, about any of these things.
Yeah, we really can't. If you take any of this stuff seriously, and like, I'm not a climate change denialist, it absolutely is a real thing. It definitely needs to be addressed. But if we're focusing on literally the thing that might be a solution and is not the primary driver, how are we going to fix that? And people may be like, I don't know, this sounds kind of dubious, but all I would suggest is, like, if it's that big of a deal, then really make sure that I'm wrong. Get in and read the book, watch the film, read all the literature that we cite in there, and then come back with your own piece, whether it's a blog or a podcast or what have you, and detail all the places that Diana and I get that wrong, because we are the vanguard of suggesting this alternate view. Or maybe we actually have this right, and we need to, at a local and a global level, like, tackle this stuff in a very different way.
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say, the cow farts thing always makes me laugh, because this goes back to let's just think about sort of the obvious here. The obvious fact that, like, how many ruminants, meaning animals like cows and buffaloes and things, were like roaming the countryside before humans came along, right? I'm pretty sure it was a shit ton of them. And somehow climate change wasn't happening because of their farts, right? Like, and so it's like, man, I don't think that's probably the real thing going on there. I don't know. I'm not a scientist.
And if climate change really is important, then we need to get that right,
Yes,
or maybe it's
absolutely
not that important. Yeah. And then we can get it wrong.
Yeah. All right, Rob. Well, I know you got to go. I really appreciate it, man. And I'm going to hold you to dinner at some point.
We will.
It's in our.
We will make it happen. I promise.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks so much, brother. Great seeing you, as always. Love your insight on this stuff. It's great to talk to somebody who's a lot smarter on it than I am. So really appreciate it.
I just have an area of expertise that's an inch wide and a mile deep. So thank you.
Well, good. We need people like that. Thanks, bro.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Rare Sense podcast. Remember that Rare Sense content is not medical advice, nor does it represent the official position or opinions of any other organization or person. If you require diagnosis or treatment for a mental or physical issue or illness, please seek it from a licensed professional. Also, if you're enjoying Rare Sense content, there are many places where you can find it and help level up your mental health. You can subscribe to this podcast on any major streaming platform, and please leave a 5-star review if you love it. You can subscribe to the Rare Sense Substack, which is where I publish all of my content, and you can find that at raresense.substack.com. And that includes a monthly article released on the 1st of every month, a monthly book recommendation, Thing to Read, which is released on the 15th of every month, the podcast episodes, and weekly Mind Warrior training, which is released every Sunday. You can subscribe to the Rare Sense YouTube channel. You can take the Rare Sense Challenge, which is on my website at raresense.com. You can connect with me on all major social media platforms at this Chris Irwin. And you can invite me to speak about mind fitness to your organization by filling out the contact form on the Rare Sense website. You can also support my work by purchasing Rare Sense gear, which is on the website as well. Thanks so much for your support.